So if we look at the figures from 2011, what we can see is that there was 48.4% of the population which were Protestant. However, there was 45.1% that were Catholic. Now the figures have changed, whereby there's a 43.5% that are Protestant and 45.7% which are Catholic, right? So it's still not an overall majority of people who are Catholics, but it's still a plurality. And actually, when we look at this, right, you can see that obviously the non-religious community has now risen from 5.6% to 9.3%, and this matches the kind of trend that you see throughout the Western world, which is that people become more and more irreligious. However, this does mask the deeper figures, yeah, when one looks at it, because if one looks at it on an overall thing, people identifying as Catholic or Protestant, for the most part, this comes from people growing up in Protestant households or growing up in Catholic households. But when we actually look at people's current religion, this is where we see the big difference. So we can see that 42.3% identify as being Catholic, compared to just 37.4% which identify as being Protestant. So what we can see with that is obviously, when we break it down in terms of current religion, Catholics are much, much larger of a percentage than Protestants are. And this is for multiple different reasons. So first of all, you have the higher immigration rates. So many people from Poland, Lithuania, etc., mainly like Catholic countries. So people coming to Northern Ireland in that guise, right? Of course, they are going to fluff up the Catholic population. Similarly as well, the birth rates amongst Catholics has always been much higher. So this is part of the reason why, as you can see from the figures here, the Catholic population has risen like that in absolute terms, not just percentage, whereas the Protestant population, not just in percentage terms, has gone down, but actually in real terms, in terms of number of adherents, has fallen over the decades. And what we can also see is that the people in Northern Ireland who are most irreligious tend to be in the parts of the country which have the strongest kind of like Protestant majority, right? So as you can see on this map here, this kind of really illustrates that. So with all that being said, we kind of have covered the religious aspect to it. But the religious aspect to it, like we said, is quite a kind of surface level thing, which I think is kind of moving out of prominence. So now we're going to be focusing on the national identity aspect to it. Now, of course, national identity is quite a complicated thing. So some people identify, exclusively with just one national identity. For some people, it's a mixture. Some people it's a dual nationality, or they have triple the nationality, etc. So that's what we're going to look into with regard to this. So the census, it does ask people whether they are only British, only Irish, etc., etc., and it also asks whether they are a combination of these different things. So if we're looking first of all at British only, what we can see is that in 2011, only 39.9% of the population identified only as being British. However, that figure now in 2021 has now fallen to 31.9%. And when we look at the people who identify as Irish only, that has risen from 25.3% up to 29.1%. And in terms of those who see themselves as Northern Irish only, this has fallen from 20.9% down to 19.8%. Now, when we look at those with a combined British identity, so this is people who identify as being British and Northern Irish, or just British, or British and blah, 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 etc., etc. When we look at these figures, what we can see is that in 2011, the figures was 48.4%. which actually happens to correlate quite neatly with what the Protestant population was in those years, right? But when we look at it now in 2021, we can see that that figure has now fallen to 42.8%. And when we look at Irish combined, this has risen from 28.4% up to 33.3%. And when we look at Northern Irish combined, it has risen from 29.4% up to 31.5%. Now, in terms of the makeup of the different districts, this has largely remained the same. So in 2015, they have like redrawn what the different districts are and stuff. They combine different districts. But what we can find is that there are 11 districts in Northern Ireland. And the only one which has had an actual shift away from one thing to the other is Belfast, right? So with regard to the national identity, right, if one looks at Belfast, one can see that in 2011, 43.3% identified as being British, and now that figure has dropped to just 36.8%. However, in terms of those who identify as being Irish, this has risen from 35.1% up to 40.3%. So we can see how Belfast, which is the capital of Northern Ireland, a plurality of people in the capital of Northern Ireland now identify as being Irish rather than being British for the very first time. And what we can see also is that 5 out of the 11 districts have an Irish plurality, right? So again, considering that Northern Ireland, as we said, was set up originally to be one thing or the other, right? Now we're starting to see a bit more of a breakdown of that, right? And it's starting more to head in that direction. However, one thing to kind of note is that, as we said in the video about a case for redrawing the Irish border, we'll talk about that a little bit later. With that video, I made the point that there are certain districts within Northern Ireland which lean more heavily towards the British side and others which lean more towards the Irish nationalist side, right? So of the 6 out of the 11 which identify more with the Unionist cause, one can see that in terms of British national identity, this is combined British national identity, right? And also as well, I should say that these figures are very back of the napkin kind of thing. I've not broken it down in terms of actual population and such. I've taken these percentages and divided by 6. So it's kind of crude, but at the same time, it gives you an indication of what the figures are. So that's just the disclaimer before we say these figures. And what we can find is that in the Unionist districts, one can see that 56.6% of people identify as being British, and this is in a combined sense, compared to just 19.8% who identify as being Irish with a combined sense, right? When we compare this to the nationalist districts, this is the 5 out of the 11, we can see that 28% of people identify as being British, compared to 47.7% who identify as being Irish. So this kind of gives you an idea with regard to national feelings, right, and like how people identify. So we can already see that there is a vast difference between the places, which particularly on the eastern side of Northern Ireland, right, compared to those parts which are closer to the Irish border. But national identity is a little bit like gender identity in a way, right? So bear with me on that point. My point being is that one can identify as this and one can identify as that, right? But it's relatively fluid, right? However, something which is a bit more concrete is passport holding, right? So first of all, like unlike in America, most people in Northern Ireland actually have passports and stuff. But the thing is with having a passport is that it's a logistical thing, right? You have to go down to the passport office or you have to apply online, etc., etc. It's a lot of hassle. Anyone who's had to renew their passport knows how much of a hassle it is, right? So for you to go to all those lengths, bearing in mind that people in Northern Ireland, like we said, have the option of picking, do you want to be British or do you want to be Irish, right? For you to go through all that process, you have to really identify with one or the other, right? And what one tends to find was that although people can have dual nationalism, right? Like, you know, in terms of like having 2 sets of passports, again, would one really want to go through those lengths, you know, like twice? No, for the most part, people either have a British passport or they have an Irish passport. So with regard to all this, yeah, this is what we find with the data for this. So what we can find is that in 2011, 59.1% of the population had a British passport, compared to in 2021, 52.6% now have British passports. So there's a clear drop in that. However, those who have an Irish passport has now risen significantly, and it's risen from 20.8% to 32.3% with an Irish passport. So in Northern Ireland, of the 11 districts, 4 out of those 11 districts have a plurality with an Irish passport. And what's interesting is that although we said that Belfast now has plurality of people who identify as being Irish as opposed to British, when it comes to those who own passports in Belfast, a plurality of them actually still maintain having a British passport. So it's interesting that people there, you know, they might identify more as being Irish, but they still, probably for practical reasons, still have British passports. So if one looks at this in terms of, you know, the Unionist districts compared to the Nationalist districts, yeah, this is part of what we find, right? So in terms of the Unionist districts, we can see that 62.3% of the people there have British passports, compared to just 24.1% who have Irish passports. Now, the thing is, obviously, that is including Belfast in that, right? However, if we exclude Belfast in that, the figures rise even more so for the British side and fall even more for the Irish side. So what we can see is that of the 6 districts which are predominantly British, right? We can see 64.4% of people there have British passports, compared to just 22.2% which have Irish passports. Now, when we compare this conversely to the nationalist districts, we can see that 36.7% have British passports compared to 45.3% which have Irish passports. And with this, if we include Belfast, what we find is that you have a sway more towards the British side and less towards the Irish side. And this is where we find that 39.3% have British passports compared to 43.4% which have Irish passports. So with all that, what we can see clearly, and this was the point that I made last year when I was talking about redrawing the Northern Irish border, is that clearly there is a difference between one part of Northern Ireland and the rest of it. And actually these differences are even more sizable when we compare the two extremes on either side. So when we look at Ard and North Down compared to Derry City and Strabane, and apologies if I've mispronounced it, mispronouncing Irish names is my thing on this channel, but that's just that, right? But if we compare these two, what we find is that in Ard and North Down, 75.8% of people have British passports compared to just 16.3%, whereas in Derry, we see that 32.8% of people have British passports compared to 51.8% have Irish passports. So this is why last year I made the case that logically it makes sense to redraw the Irish border, right? Because clearly it's not reflecting the situation on the ground. However, I've changed my stance on that, right? And the reason I've changed my stance on that is one to do with